It's my very great pleasure to see so many of you here tonight. That's excellent. And of course, Tom Switzer has spoken to us before, which is one of the reasons there are so many of you here tonight. It's also a pretty interesting topic that Tom is going to talk to us tonight about, which is, has the US provoked the Russian bear in Ukraine? Tom is a research associate at the University of Sydney's United States Studies Centre, and he's also the Australian editor of the Spectator, the very well regarded UK magazine. He's a former opinion editor of the Australian, and he writes occasionally still, for the Australian Financial Review, and he's an assistant editor at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington DC. So he's written for very many publications. And we're delighted that we may see more of Tom in the future, as he is moving to Brisbane with his family in July. So I'm not going to tell you more about that which Tom will talk to us, as he's going to talk to us. Tom Switzer, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Jeffrey, and thank you all for being here. I must say, from the outset, I'm quite impressed that so many of you are prepared to see me and not the Treasurer speak this evening. Some might say we are still bad news, regardless of how you look at it, the budget or the big bear Russia. But I hope to be a source of good news at the end of this today. I think one thing is clear, though: the Australian people, in many respects like the American people, are increasingly sick and tired of federal politics. And you may recall the Henry Kissinger joke about the Iraq-Iran war in the 1980s, that it's a shame that both sides can't lose. I think you could say that about Australian politics and indeed American politics. If you speak to Republicans, Democrats, Liberals, Nationals, LNP, and the Labor side, I think there is a widespread disgust with the political landscape in both America and in Australia. And I think you could say the same thing in many respects about the British political landscape and Western Europe generally. And I think nowhere is this more evident than in the United States. I think I've addressed this branch 3 times in the last 3 or so years, and I think it is fair to say that more than 5 years into the Obama administration, the American people remain in a very foul mood. You may recall that they turned viciously against the Bush administration over the Iraq war and the global financial crisis. I think all the available public polling evidence indicates that the American people think their country is heading in the wrong direction, which in some respects is odd, given the fact that the economy is on an upswing trajectory. The last quarter of economic growth was admittedly very lackluster. It was only 0.01 in fact. But the unemployment rate is coming down, and of course the shale gas revolution promises to provide a lot of economic bonanzas for the United States into the future, and may well be a geopolitical game changer. But nevertheless, all the available public polling evidence indicates the American people think their country is heading in the wrong direction, and they're dissatisfied with both Republicans on Capitol Hill as well as the Democrat president, Barack Obama. And I think it is fair to say that nowhere is this more evident than in the area of foreign affairs. And intriguingly, this is a subject that has received very little attention in the public debate in Canberra. There was an NBC Wall Street Journal poll published last week that showed that more than 50% of the American people, 50% of the American people want to the language is complicated, but it all boils down to a very non-interventionist view of the world. This is the highest level of public angst about America's global leadership role in the world since public polling began, even worse than during the aftermath of the Vietnam War, and certainly more dispiriting than the mood in America following the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think this is quite extraordinary that so many Americans, whether they're Republicans and Democrats, are dissatisfied with the notion of American global leadership in the world. And Barack Obama himself, his approval rating is only 38%, which is his lowest when it comes to his handling of foreign policy. it's even lower. Well, it's about more or less the same as George W. Bush, although Bush reached probably early to mid-30s, you know, in 2006 before the surge of US troops in Iraq. But it is very low, and particularly when you consider that Barack Obama came to the White House in 2008 promising that he would redefine the American role in the world in a way that reflected America's changing circumstances and more limited resources. He even had one offsider give a statement to the New Yorker magazine saying that the Obama doctrine was about leading from behind. And yet, the American people, by and large, with some rare exceptions, think that the Obama administration has been too interventionist in the world. And while they're grateful that the Obama administration is not committing troops to the standoff in Ukraine, they still feel, I believe at least from reading the opinion polling evidence, that the administration has overreached when it comes to Russia. And that is essentially what I want to talk about today. I think it is fair to say that for the people of Ukraine, or at least the non-ethnic Russian people of Ukraine, and they're a majority, the failure of Washington and Brussels to stop Moscow's intervention, first in the Crimean Peninsula, and then of course in several eastern towns, has been sad and dispiriting. But I think for the West itself, that failure serves to highlight what I would call three illusions that have distorted the US and the EU policy towards Russia in the post-Cold War era. Tonight I really want to focus on one of those illusions, but I need to mention the other two. The first illusion is this notion that with the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the conventional wisdom in Washington and in Brussels was that the West, politically speaking, had a moral duty and a strategic interest to go east. The second illusion, I believe, was this idea that the West, politically speaking, not culturally, but politically speaking, would remain unified in the post-Cold War era. And the third illusion was this notion that with the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the United States would be a unipolar power that would impose its will, influence, leadership, example across the globe. And I think all three illusions have been badly damaged in the course of Ukraine. Let's talk about the first illusion, which I believe is the most important and novel argument in this debate, and this is the idea that the West should go east. In the Clinton and George W. Bush eras, the US and its Cold War allies in Western Europe expanded the Atlantic Alliance into Eastern Europe, the Baltics as well. Add to this Washington's attempts to deploy US ballistic missiles in the region and offer NATO membership to both Georgia and Ukraine, which of course Russia had long deemed as its sphere of influence. Seen from Moscow's vantage point, and this is one of the themes throughout this talk, we'll try to look at this from Russia's vantage point, that in no way, shape or form endorses Moscow's behaviour. Certainly Putin's conduct in many respects has been reprehensible and illegal, but I think in terms of understanding international relations, it always helps to understand the perspective of your opponent. And from Russia's perspective, the calls by the European Union and the Obama administration, or senior diplomats within the administration, to topple, and let's not forget, the democratically elected, albeit corrupt, pro-Russian government in Kiev in February, from Russia's perspective, this was further proof that neither Brussels nor Washington takes into account Russia's susceptibilities and its sense of strategic security interests. Now, of course, many Western pundits, particularly in Washington, left and right, liberal, neoconservative, Washington Post opinion page, which is a fairly, all things considered, a liberal editorial page, the Wall Street Journal editorial page, which is crudely putting it neoconservative. Their argument is that because Russia lost the Cold War, it should simply come to grips with the reality of its decline as a great power and accept that Western expansion into what Russia sees as its near abroad is paved with benign intentions. But I would argue, and although my voice is probably a minority in the public debate, there are a few of us, I would argue this is very complicated. I think for one thing, strategic interests and traditional motives of prestige made the Baltics and Eastern Europe a matter of intense importance to Russia well before Stalin arrived on the scene. And there's many foreign policy realists, like Hans J. Morgenthau from Chicago University, Walter Lippmann, the great post-war realist, Henry Kissinger, who I think is 90 this year, who wrote an op-ed piece in the Washington Post about this very subject just a few weeks ago, and John Mearsheimer from Chicago. These realists have long argued that a sphere of influence is a key characteristic of a great power. Even a great democracy such as the United States claimed a sphere of influence before it emerged as a genuine great power. Since President James Monroe in the 1820s claimed for the United States a sphere of influence in the Caribbean, and Central America. The US has intervened in Haiti, Cuba, Nicaragua, Panama, Grenada, and the Dominican Republic. Now, none of this is extraordinary. It is perfectly the way the great powers conduct affairs. And notwithstanding John Kerry, the Secretary of State, his recent claim that the Monroe Doctrine is dead, it is the way the great powers more or less still conduct foreign affairs. Look at it like this. Imagine how Washington would respond if Russia or China or another power were to intrude militarily into Central America or interfere in the internal affairs of a Mexican election that brought down a pro-American government. Moreover, the West's move eastwards, I would argue, again, a minority view, has represented a betrayal of the Cold War settlement reached between Washington and Moscow in the early 1990s. Now, unfashionable though it is to say so today, the events from 1989 to 1991, and this year, believe it or not, marks the 25th anniversary since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of history thesis that was associated with it. Those events, again, opinion is divided. Some say it represents the triumph of the American mission to redeem the world. But many foreign policy realists would argue that this amounted to a political miracle. We had a Soviet regime, a brutal totalitarian dictatorship, nearly as tyrannical and aggressive as Nazi Germany, voluntarily jettisoned its Warsaw Pact satellite states in late 1989. It then acquiesced in the dismantling of its empire in the Baltics and Ukraine in 1991, gave up communism as an ideology, and embraced democracy, all, let's remember, virtually with no violence, or very little violence. Such dramatic changes were by no means inevitable. When empires usually collapse, they coincide with brutality and bloodshed. You just think of the British withdrawal from Kenya, Malaya, the Indian subcontinent, or the French withdrawal from Vietnam and Algeria, the Belgians from Congo, the Portuguese from Timor. What occurred in the case of the Soviet Empire was really, all things considered, very much the exception. The question is, why? Why didn't Moscow resist the forces of change and extend its empire's life by imposing brutal order on renegade satellite states among the former Soviet republics and the client states in Eastern Europe? After all, previous springtimes of reform in the Soviet Empire had been followed by a summer of repression. You think of East Germany in 1953, Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968, and Poland in 1981. Question: why did the Soviet Union, unlike most empires, die so peacefully? And I believe the answer lies in recognising that the Cold War ended by negotiation to the advantage of both the Soviets and the Americans. For whatever has been said during the past 2 decades or so, both Presidents George H.W. Bush and President Gorbachev reached an agreement in the early 1990s, and the agreement was that in exchange for a reunified Germany to be part of NATO, the West would not enlarge its security commitments. And in effect, and there's a lot of literature on this very subject that hasn't really been mentioned in great detail in the course of the last few months, but it's there. And the bargain gave Washington everything it wanted. The quid pro quo was that it would refrain from doing what it had never expressed any intention of doing. That is, take advantage of Moscow by advancing strategically into what historically had been Russia's near abroad. Now, admittedly, there was no formal treaty to codify this agreement, but that is because there was already an implicit understanding between the protagonists. Sergei Karachnikov, a Russian strategist and a future Putin advisor, he said, quote, "In 1990, we, Russians, were told quite clearly by the West that dissolution of the Warsaw Pact and German reunification would not lead to NATO expansion. We did not demand written guarantees because in the euphoric atmosphere of that time, it would have seemed almost indecent, like two girlfriends giving written promises not to seduce each other's husbands." Now, as we now know, and my friend Scott McConnell from the American Conservative magazine Washington's made this point, the more versatile and powerful girlfriend did indeed seduce first Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, and has since pushed further into nations and regions that are perceived by Russians to be literally part of historic Russia. Or take Stephen Walt, the distinguished Harvard political scientist who was a guest at the centre I work at the University of Sydney just 2 weeks ago. Quote, "Intoxicated by its own self-proclaimed role as the indispensable nation," remember this was Madeleine Albright's formulation in the mid-1990s, "the US was increasingly willing to extend security guarantees to almost anyone who asked them." And this is why someone like Jack Matlock, who was the US ambassador in Russia in 87 through to 92, so as all of this was happening, he has backed up all the Russian accounts of the implicit agreement between President Bush and Gorbachev, but he says, or rather laments, he wrote a piece in the Washington Post just a month ago, the US has treated Russia as a loser since the end of the Cold War, which is a great mistake. The argument here is that the US has essentially reneged on its side of the bargain. And you have to remember that during the mid to late 1990s, and I was lucky enough to be living in Washington throughout this period, I worked at a think tank called the American Enterprise Institute. Tony Jones, the late line presenter, once called it the belly of the beast during the Iraq War because it's full of neoconservative intellectuals. This is when I was very young and I subsequently got mugged by reality, but nevertheless, AEI played a very prominent role in the NATO debate. And it was great to be president at the creation. This was in 95 through to the late 90s. And NATO, for the Russians at least, was a four-letter word. I mean, a real four-letter word. In hindsight, and this is the argument that I'm making tonight, it's the argument people like John Mearsheimer, Stephen Walt, I think in many respects, some of the senior members of the first Bush administration, they would argue, of course, that they were right to be cautious about the collapse of the Soviet Union into 15 separate nations. And they were right to be cautious about the prospect of turmoil and chaos that this process could unleash because they studied their history lessons. They knew that other great powers and great empires, when they collapse, it often leads to brutality and bloodshed. And this is why, far from expressing excitement over the new freedom in Eastern Europe and the Baltics, that of course, remember, Cold Warriors from Harry Truman to Ronald Reagan could only dream of. And yet, President Bush Sr., his senior advisors like James Baker, Lawrence Eagleburger, Brent Scowcroft, Colin Powell to some extent, they chose to project calm. We forget this today, given the triumphalism of America and the West with the collapse of the Soviet Empire, but in that crucial period in 89 to 92, they projected calm. Such concerns, I'd argue, were especially justified given that several Soviet states, such as Belarus and Ukraine, especially Ukraine, held poorly guarded strategic nuclear weapons from the Soviet arsenal that were aimed at the United States. When the Berlin Wall collapsed in November 1989, Bush Sr., again, it's hard to believe today, but he was not in a celebratory mood. The CBS journalist Leslie Stahl, in a one-on-one with him as this was all happening, says, "This is a sort of a great victory for our side in the East-West battle, but you, Mr. President, don't seem elated." To which the President replied, "I'm not an emotional kind of guy." And when Democrats, such as a future Vice President Al Gore then Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell, berated Bush. These were Democrats berating Bush for, quote, not dancing on the Berlin Wall. Democrats were saying this about a Republican president. The president defended his reserved behaviour because, quote, I fear that triumphalism might provoke the Kremlin into cracking down on the revolutionary movements. I mean, these were legitimate concerns at the time that we all too often forget today. Simply put, Bush and his senior realist advisors around him were unenthusiastic about the prospect of the Soviet Union's violent breakup. That is why he refused to immediately recognise Lithuania in 1991, and he even went to Kiev in August of that year and publicly addressed the Ukrainian people and warned them to not embrace independence for fear that it could lead to, quote, suicidal nationalisms. This is President Bush in Kiev in early August of 1991, which happened to coincide, you may recall, with that hardliner coup against Gorbachev. It unfolded that very month in August of 1991. Bush was adamant, quote, we are not going to overexcite the American people or the world. We will conduct our diplomacy in a prudent fashion, not driven by excess, not driven by extreme. Now, of course, as we all know now, by Christmas of that year, Christmas 1991, Moscow did more or less voluntarily allow the Baltic states to separate from the Soviet Union. Liberals and conservatives in America, especially neoconservatives, have consistently condemned Bush since. They've condemned him for failing to enthusiastically embrace national self-determination among the Soviet republicans in 1991, because obviously the events since then have vindicated their stance. One leading conservative columnist, who's now no longer with us, but William Safire, a former Nixon advisor, who was a very distinguished, long-time columnist at the New York Times, he dubbed Bush's address in Kiev that I just mentioned as the Chicken Kiev speech. Bush apparently was so outraged by Safire, he never had anything to do with him again. He cut him off. You know, often when journalists or columnists write opinion pieces that upset prime ministers, they just cut them off. They don't like them. I wrote a piece today about Tony Abbott criticising him. I hope he doesn't cut me off. But anyway, this was the conventional wisdom at the time. Again, I would argue Bush's low-profile use of American diplomatic and economic leverage over the Kremlin constrained. We'll never know, of course, but there's a strong argument that at the time, given the euphoria of the times and the uncertainty and the unpredictability, it constrained Gorbachev's ability to crack down on nationalist movements in the Baltic states. And Bush at the time, he said that the enemy is unpredictability, the enemy is instability. And he subsequently wrote his memoirs with his national security advisor, Brett Scowcroft, in the late 1990s, making the point, quote, I did not want to encourage a course of events which might turn violent and get out of hand. And he made the point in the memoirs, and he hasn't laboured the point really since, because he hasn't been, which is rare for a former president or a prime minister for that matter, very rarely wages into the public debates. But certainly people like Baker, Scowcroft and Eagleberger and many of their realist defenders, such as myself, make the point that a more belligerent response from Washington could have easily strengthened rather than weakened the Moscow hardliners. And as I say, we'll never know, but I think it's a fair bet that by taking into account Russian susceptibilities, Bush helped set the scene for a relatively peaceful transformation of the Soviet Empire. And I want to emphasise this point again. This is so crucial, and I think when you look at the history of great powers, the peaceful disintegration of an empire is historically abnormal. The English scholar Martin Wright, arguably one of England's leading experts on international relations in the post-war period, said, great power status is lost as it is won by violence. A great power does not die in its bed. Now, all of this is a way of bringing us to the Russian incursion in Ukraine in recent months. Again, many liberals and conservatives, although I would argue they're a minority view in Middle America, but certainly if you read the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Many of the prominent think tanks, whether it be Brookings on the left or AEI, where I worked, on the right, the talk show channels, there is a general consensus that although Russia is a great power, it's a rapidly declining great power, and it does not have the capacity or the right to insist on a vast sphere of influence. So from the outset, Putin's motives have always been seen as illegitimate. Now, I think there's no question that Russia is a declining great power. Demography is severely working against Russia in so many ways. Its economy is very sluggish. I suspect that if the Bush administration, if it were united with Western European countries and ranked up the sanctions and made them more targeted towards certain sectors of the Russian economy, Russia would pay a price. But the point here, though, is that Ukraine matters far more to Russia than it does to the United States or Western Europe. Ethnic Russians number nearly 60% of the population in Crimea, and of course nearly a quarter in Greater Ukraine. Russia's naval base for the Black Sea Fleet is based in Sevastopol in Crimea, and Ukraine, of course, is a next-door neighbour that is a conduit for Russian trade. When push turns to shove, when the moment of truth arrives, a great power will be assertive when its vital interests are at stake. And if desperate and humiliated further, Russia arguably could be dangerous in the way that a wounded animal can be dangerous. Remember, we're talking about a country that still has an enormous arsenal of nuclear weapons. And in such circumstances, providing a Russian nationalist, such as Putin, whose popularity has risen dramatically during the course of the last few months, providing that person with a cause to exploit is surely playing with fires. Now, intriguingly, I'll get back to the point I was talking about when I worked at AEI, when I was present at the creation of the momentum to push NATO east. Many of these arguments that I'm making now about upsetting the bear, not taking into account Russian susceptibilities and strategic interests, many of these arguments were made at the time in the mid to late 1990s. And many of the opponents of NATO expansion were on, they were ideologically and politically diverse. They were Democrats and Republicans, they were liberals and conservatives, but they were admittedly the minority. One such critic was George Kennan. Now, many of you will know George Kennan was the intellectual architect of the containment doctrine in 1947. Writing in the New York Times precisely half a century later, 1997, Kennan warned, quote, "Expanding NATO would be the most fateful era of American policy in the post-Cold War era. Among other things, NATO enlargement would likely inflame the nationalistic, anti-Western and militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion, to have an adverse effect on the development of Russian democracy, to restore the atmosphere of the Cold War to East-West relations, and to impel Russian foreign policy in directions decidedly not to our liking." I mean, that's an extraordinary quote that Kennan gave. It was actually an op-ed piece he wrote in the New York Times in 1997. Another critic was James Schlesinger, the former CIA director, Energy Secretary and Defense Secretary in the Nixon, Ford and Carter administrations. He worked for a Democrat and a Republican president in the 1970s. And he also, I've got two young daughters, and I just struggle looking after two young daughters. He had something like 8 kids, and he had these portfolios during the course of his period in office when he was only in his early to mid-40s, my age. I don't know how the hell he did it. But anyway, I digress. He died in March, Schlesinger. He died in March. Now, Schlesinger, as you might suspect, was a Cold Warrior, a strong, unashamed supporter of the containment doctrine. But interestingly, after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, remember I mentioned President Bush and people like Scowcroft and Eagleberger and Powell. I think in many respects Schlesinger was part of their intellectual pedigree. He started to change his thinking about the direction of US foreign policy in the Clinton years. And he wrote a very prescient piece in the National Interest magazine, again in 1997, same year as Kennan's op-ed in the New York Times. And he warned about, quote, and he's talking about the United States, under Clinton, not Bush, a growing condition of national hubris, a compulsion to instruct others on how to behave, to hector and attempt to give US law extraterritorial reach, America, Schlesinger feared, was becoming, quote, a universal international nag that was alienating many friendly nations. In its editorial tribute to Schlesinger, who died in late March, the Wall Street Journal editorial page suggested that Schlesinger, who of course had impeccable credentials as a Cold Warrior, would, quote, today be more resolutely opposed to Russia's incursion into Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula than official Washington. But if you go back and look at Schlesinger's views on the subject, as I've done, he thought that NATO expansion was a bad idea in the mid-1990s, and unlike many liberals and conservatives today, he was indeed sensitive to Russian strategic concerns in, quote, the more complex and ambiguous environment of the post-Cold War era. In 2001, he observed that there are numerous Americans, quote, who come out of the Cold War experience and kind of miss the excitement, end of quote. Quoting Winston Churchill, Schlesinger said, victory in the Cold War argued now for magnanimity. That's Churchill's famous line, the lessons of the Versailles Peace Treaty was not to rub the face of a defeated foe in the dirt. You know, Weimar Germany, you try to rebuild Germany and to make it a more peaceful and prosperous place. In many respects, he was trying to apply that argument to the Soviet Union. I think it's fair to say that Schlesinger was no softie. Kennan had a more mixed record, but Schlesinger recognised the stupidity of grinding the face of a defeated foe in the dirt. As the US and several European Union states intend to punish Russia with more economic sanctions and increase economic, strategic and diplomatic support for Ukraine's, let's remember, unelected interim and anti-Russian government, I think there is much to be said for the Schlesinger view of the world, and I suspect that George H.W. Bush, perhaps not his son, but the father, would certainly agree. Now that's the first illusion that I think has been shattered in the post-Cold War environment. The other two illusions I'll deal with very briefly, and we can talk more in Q&A. I think the second illusion that has been badly damaged held that in the post-Cold War era, the West could act as a purposeful leading actor in Europe, one with a unified will and the means of giving it effective expression. Again, this was a conventional wisdom 20 years ago. I think that was yesterday. Since then, the West has been disunited on several issues, most notably in the lead up to the Iraq War. You may recall in the latter part of 2002 and the early part of 2003 in the countdown to the war on Baghdad, several prominent Western European countries, France, Germany, most notably, came out and opposed the US-British intervention in Iraq. Interestingly, the then Defence Secretary Donald Rumsfeld made a call that he tried to distinguish between old Europe and new Europe. New Europe, of course, were the emerging democracies that America helped flourish in the post-Cold War era. They were unashamed supporters of the intervention in Iraq, as opposed to the old European countries of France and Germany that were dying demographically and were no longer serious defence players in the international debate. We also saw some serious disagreements between the Bush Junior administration and again France and Germany in 2008 at the NATO summit, when the Bush administration was very keen to include both Georgia and Ukraine as part of NATO. The French said non merci, and that did not go anywhere. And of course now in Ukraine, faced with the first violation of territorial integrity since Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, certainly in Europe since Hitler's escapades in the 1930s, again we're seeing the West failing miserably and comprehensively to respond to these threats. And I think all of this raises very good questions about the notion of the political West. I mean, certainly the countries of the West share vast commonalities, history, culture, political values, institutions, but when it comes to the political alliance of the West, as my friend Owen Harries pointed out in Foreign Affairs magazine 20 years ago, it is not a natural construct, but a highly artificial one. And Harries made this point 20 years ago. It took the presence of a life-threatening, overtly hostile East to bring the political West into existence to maintain its unity. We've seen that its different. We'll find that it's very difficult that the political West can survive the disappearance of that enemy. Now, of course, the US on its own, I would argue, can still impose great economic pain on Russia via those sectoral sanctions. But remember this, in this interdependent world, Ukraine is heavily in debt to Russia. It depends heavily on Russia for oil and natural gas. Moscow could bring down the Ukrainian economy, and there'll be up to $35 to $40 billion needed to get the Ukrainian economy out of bankruptcy for the next 2 years if that were to happen. Now, are the Europeans really enthusiastic about an economic war with Russia, which will double their price on a bailout, the Ukraine, after they've had to carry, what, Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal for these bailouts? Why would they want to carry that economic burden? And if the Germans, whose traditions are not wholly pacifist, and the French and the British are not going to stand up against Putin, how long does the United States carry this burden? Remember this, no American president during the Cold War cared a hoot about whether a Russian flag flies over Ukraine or a Ukrainian flag flies over Crimea. None of them moved east of the Elbe River. They just held the line, and the Cold War came to what we would say is a negotiated settlement. The third illusion, and I'll wrap it up here, that I think has been badly damaged, is the notion that the United States, with the collapse of the Cold War, the end of the Soviet Empire, would become a benign hegemon, the sole remaining superpower, the indispensable nation, as Madeleine Albright once put it. And I would argue again that that rhetoric that we saw in the 1990s, and this was becoming the conventional wisdom in the mid to late 1990s as NATO was expanding, that America was a global hegemon. I think that with 9/11, the outrage over the terrorist attacks combined with the mental habits of American global hegemony of the previous decade, along with the notion of American exceptionalism, that was a combustive mixture. And although they express themselves in different ways, I think it's fair to say that both liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans have believed in this idea. Just listen to two secretaries of state who epitomised a belief in the virtues of uninhibited American interventionism. In 2008, Condoleezza Rice declared, quote, "It's absolutely clear that we will be involved in nation building for years to come." Well, you know, you look at what happened in Syria. Far from it. The American president doesn't want to go anywhere near that. In fact, the American president went to Putin, essentially, to bail him out. In 2010, Hillary Clinton said, "It is in our DNA, American DNA, to believe that there are no limits on what is possible or what can be achieved." Now, of course, it's true that the United States possesses unparalleled military means to defeat any other country. But the point that I think has been proven again, in this time in Ukraine, is that there is not an American solution to every problem. In fact, there are a good many problems. Syria's civil war is unfortunately another case for which there may be no solution at all. Again, I go back to the realists like Kennan, Morgenthau, Kissinger. Americans do not have the understanding of other societies and people, the attention span or staying power to engage in an active interventionist policy of nation building and democracy promotion on a large scale. And this is particularly evident at a time when a vast majority of Americans, this gets back to my introduction, believe it is high time for the nation to concentrate on its own neglected internal problems. The defence budget has fallen and will continue to fall, and there is a strong aversion to seeing US soldiers killed and wounded. Now, to the extent that such views prevail, I would argue that they are inimical to the notion of an activist global hegemon that will impose its will, leadership and influence across the globe. And I think that is one of the three illusions that have been shattered in Ukraine. So that's really my thesis. It's a provocative thesis, particularly in Washington, but nevertheless I am grateful for the counsel of many prominent foreign policy thinkers, particularly from that Bush administration period, who have helped me tonight in devising my remarks. And I'm happy to be tested and subjected to as much scrutiny as you'd like to throw at me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. Well, I'm sure there is some provocation there, and I'm sure some want to provoke. Reg, you wouldn't want to provoke, would you? Reg Little.
No, I'd like, first of all, to compliment you, because I think that was a very erudite, very persuasive, and very politic presentation of a topic I think is extraordinarily difficult now. But I suspect you've dodged the real issue. I think Putin has set a trap for America, and the people who've initiated what's happening in Ukraine have walked straight into it. I doubt very much that Obama was part of that initiation, but he's been carried with it, he's now stuck with it, and it seems to me America's going to pay a very high price to get out of it. Your presentation here tonight shows the best way it's got for getting out, but it's going to get out very damaged, very compromised, probably over a decade or two, having lost Eastern Europe back to Russia, and probably in the process having lost Western Europe too as part of the West, and become isolated and withdrawn into itself, as you're half suggesting it has to do. For a country like Australia, which I think is militarily, politically and psychologically very dependent on America, which I'm often critical of, I think that's very distressing, because I don't think America anymore has the capacity to extend any serious influence into this part of the world. And a critical element of that, of course, is something we haven't touched on tonight, and that's the growing alliance between Russia and China, which is leading to the potential of a major compromise very quickly of the US dollar. And that could even come to the front this year in Australia with the G20 meeting, where you've got the G7, you've got the remains on one side and the BRICS on the other, and Australia presiding over it. So I'm sorry, that's a lot there.
Sure. Well, first of all, I don't want to overstate my argument. I think we should recognise that there are a lot of Eastern European states, as indeed many East Asian states, that are clamouring for US security guarantees. Many countries in Eastern Europe are very nervous about Russia, for good reason. They've got history on their side. Likewise in East Asia. Who would have thought that Vietnam, America's Cold War nemesis in the 60s and 70s, would be clamouring for US security guarantees? Why? Because they're worried about a rising China. Who would have thought that the Philippines, a former US colony, who kicked out the US Navy from Subic Bay in 1992, would also be clamouring for US security guarantees. In fact, President Obama just announced a new security agreement with Manila 2 weeks ago. So I think we should always remember that these other great powers like China and Russia, I would argue, upset more of their neighbours than the Americans do. My point, though, is that the United States, and you're quite right, I think, to identify, it wasn't Obama himself, but some senior diplomats, such as Victoria Nuland, the US Secretary of State for that part of the world, who happens to be married to Robert Kagan, one of America's leading neoconservative thinkers. She was caught on tape saying, I won't use the word, F the EU for not putting pressure on the then pro-Russian government in Kiev. And she was even handing out pastries to the anti-Russian protesters in the street of Kiev.
And $5 billion.
Indeed, all these carrots. So that's right. I think you've got to bear that in mind. Now, what happens now? Well, I think Putin was very interesting last week. He did 3 things. And you've got to be a bit cynical, but nevertheless, taken together, they could represent a possible turning point. Putin came out and said he's calling on the ethnic Russians in these eastern towns of Ukraine to postpone their referendum for succession. He then softened his opposition to the nationwide elections in Ukraine on May 25, which is interesting because those elections will more than likely lead to a pro-Western government. And thirdly, he made it quite clear that he would not be pushing the issue much further. And the American response was a bit perplexed because his main initiative was to say that he would withdraw the Russian troops. I think there were something like 40,000 Russian troops on the border, that he would withdraw them. but the Americans were quite understandably sceptical, so was Brussels. But again, diplomacy, soft diplomacy can lead to hard outcomes. And this more or less could have provided an opportunity, and still could provide an opportunity for the Americans and the European Union to say, well look, we'll make an agreement that Ukraine, even under a pro-Western government and an anti-Russian government, will not be part of NATO. We will make sure that we do not interfere in the internal affairs of Ukrainian politics, like they did earlier this year and late last year. And moreover, call on Kiev to give minority rights to the ethnic Russians. I think that would be a real conciliatory gesture to the Americans, and that would be a way of backing down and de-escalating the crisis. So I do think there is a way out.
What about William Hague's comments, who seemed to be far more hardline than the Americans were in reaction to Putin? He was just saying, this is a trap, don't walk into it.
Yeah.
What was he on about?
Well, I think Hague represents a minority in the Tory party in Britain. I think there is a wing, it's probably a leftover of the Thatcher era, that associates very closely with the neoconservative tradition in the United States, which is that countries like the United States and Britain should stand up for democracy and oppose any authoritarian governments. And that's how he was looking at it. But again, I get back to public opinion polls. We're talking about the American public opinion polling on this subject. In Britain, Tories, Liberal Democrats and Labor don't want to have anything to do with it. And in fact, Prime Minister Tony Blair, a great friend of America's, who led the fight against Saddam Hussein in 2003, actually called on, a few weeks ago, Washington and Brussels and London to reach out to Putin, because this would be a great deal to stop the rise of any Islamist extremist terrorist groups in the near abroad. Fascinating. So there is a great debate, I think, taking place in Britain, but I would argue that Hague is very much in the minority side.
Sure.
Okay.
Tom, can I just pick up with the comments you just made about what this means?
Can you speak up,
for our region? There's been Hugh White talks about. He says that this is all bad news. What's happened in Ukraine, because it demonstrates US weakness, and that will spur China on, make them more aggressive in our region. And others like Peter Jennings from ASPI says that actually it's good news for the US, because it will demonstrate to the Vietnams and the other countries within our region the importance of having a strong alliance with great powers like the US. What's your take on that?
Very good summary of both Hugh White and Jennings' views. I have great admiration for Hugh White. I do think all too often he gets demonised by many foreign policy commentators. I mean, he provokes outrage with his views on China. But nevertheless, I think that Jennings is more right there. I think there's always a danger in overstating linkages. I mean, I was always struck in the early 1990s that some Liberal Democrats would all too often say that because George H.W. Bush did not take a tough stand against China over the Tiananmen Square massacres in July of 1989, this set a signal to Saddam Hussein that he could get away with annexing Kuwait. Now, I do think that's a stretch. You can't rule it out, of course, and there's no evidence to indicate from Saddam's documents from that period that he saw America as weak during that period, and so he thought he'd capitalise on it. I do think there's a danger in overstating those linkages, and I also agree with Jennings that, and this is quite evident during the President's recent trip to Asia, how many countries in East Asia, not so much Australia, although we are, as you know, enhancing our security alliance with Washington, countries like Vietnam, Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, obviously South Korea, Japan, are clamouring for US security guarantees because they are genuinely worried about a rising China and what that could mean for peace and stability in the East China and South China Seas.
James O'Neill.
Yes. Thank you, Tom. I must confess that I came along tonight knowing your background with the American Enterprise Institute to hear something different from what I have heard.
Sure.
But I also think, with respect, that you tend to downplay the historical aspect from Russia's point of view. There was a Russian empire long before Marx or Lenin hove onto the scene. That empire included, for example, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. I also think that you underplay the importance that more recent history has for the Russians. That they lost, by conservative estimates, 26 million people, what they call the Great Patriotic War. that those losses came because of an invasion from the West, the Germans. But included in the German army, killing Russians, were Ukrainians who had 2 Ukrainian divisions fought with the Waffen SS. The Russians haven't forgotten.
No, good point, good point.
And they also have noted that in the coup d'etat, which took place in February this year, among the most prominent people involved were neo-Nazis, who don't even bother to hide their Nazi affiliations, and their sign is very close approximation.
National Socialists, I think some of the party, one party holds.
And they now hold 4 ministries.
Yes, and the National Security Advisor.
Yes. And they, of course, are well aware of Victoria Newland's downplaying of what the EU could have done. But they also know that America spent something like $5 billion in undermining the Yanukovych government over a lengthy period of time. And I don't want to make an alternative speech. The other point I'd make is I think you really do downplay the enormous importance of the fact you quite rightly, with respect, acknowledge the importance of the Bush Senior and Gorbachev agreement. You could have emphasised that the Americans wasted almost no time at all in breaching that agreement and have been expanding NATO eastwards ever since, when there was no legitimate reason to do so. And as you say, it totally fails to appreciate Russian sensitivities about having hostile powers on their boundary. The Americans have, for at least 200 years, given themselves the right to react the missile crisis in Cuba, 1963, 62 rather, when they thought, and that was true, the Russians had missiles in Cuba. They reacted very negatively. Why would America not expect Russia to react exactly the same way when the Americans try and put missile bases on the Polish border, the Ukrainian border, the Moldavian border, the Romanian border, the Bulgarian border, and so on and so forth? It was just totally
absolutely. Get out of our face, get out of our space. That's what Putin has said in his landmark speech to the Duma 3 weeks ago. Standing ovation, people were crying. His approval rating is 80–85%. Of course, once you bear in mind he has authoritarian tendencies, and he's trying to shut down the press and whatnot. But nevertheless, I agree with virtually everything you've just said. If anything, you've just complimented me, complimented the argument with more substance. And I'm glad you raised the point about some of these parties that are in cahoot with this unelected interim government. They do contain some nasty pieces of work. Mind you, there are a lot of good and decent people who don't like the Russian influence in Ukraine as well, and their views should also be respected.
Professor Russell Trude, I think, is next.
A colleague.
Thanks, Tom. Indeed, it is a provocative thesis. Perhaps a comment and a question. The comment is that I think it would have been extremely difficult after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the Cold War for those former East European states not to seek the kind of support they wanted from NATO and the United States. I mean, civilizationally, they are essentially Western in so many different kinds of ways. 50 years or so under the Soviet rule. I actually think that the thesis is really interesting, but I'm just wondering whether Washington had that many options in relation to what it might do, given the instincts of all those countries. And I don't think your thesis quite focuses enough attention on the realities of post-Cold War and the needs of those suddenly liberated East European countries and what they wanted out of this, and the pressure they were putting on both Brussels and Washington for support, etc. So it seems to me that closes off a lot of options that Washington might otherwise have had, and the kind of options that Bush Senior might have chosen to pervert. The question really is about, you're absolutely right, I think, about Russia's decline, and I think it provokes this question about whether or not this is a Putin activity rather than Russian activity. Because it strikes me that after the Cold War, there was a succession of rather weak or at least ineffectual Russian leaders until Putin came in his various incarnations. And there seems to me to be a very strong element of Putin's foreign policy here. Sure, it's garnered a lot of support throughout Russia, but not so much the policy of other leaders who might have been there, Medvedev, for example. So, I suppose this is one of these, well, you don't know, one of these questions you can never successfully answer, but it's a bit like, would the reaction in Ukraine have been the same if Putin hadn't been the president of the Soviet, of Russia?
Well, first of all, Russell, you're absolutely right to identify the concerns of the Eastern Europeans in the 1990s. They found their independence, they were no longer part of the Warsaw Pact, they were taking their first real serious stab at democracy, and they were yearning for American security protections and be part of the NATO umbrella. That is a fact. And I can tell you, when I was working at AI, we hosted many prominent Eastern European diplomats and policymakers who'd be making the case time and again. And they had receptive audiences, by and large. But just because the Eastern European countries were clamouring for security guarantees does not mean that the United States should have felt compelled to give them those security guarantees. We're talking about an area in the world that America had never had a significant presence. And even at the height of the Cold War, Eisenhower went to great lengths to avoid any kind of a response to the Soviet intervention in Hungary in 1956. Johnson, the Cold Warrior, another Cold Warrior, also was very cautious about the Soviets when they invaded Czechoslovakia. And of course Reagan, the great Ronald Reagan, who many argue helped bring down the Soviet Union. And I think in some respects there's a case to be made for that. But even he, during the Polish solidarity crisis in 1981, did not want to get involved. So I think there is a long history, even at the height of the Cold War, where American presidents, diplomats, exercised caution and restraint with respect to Eastern Europe. So why then in the post-Cold War era, when the circumstances, as Schlesinger, a Cold Warrior, maintained, were more complex, more ambiguous, why then should the United States then extend its security umbrella to countries that had no direct pre-Cold War affiliation? So I think the lesson here is that the United States got caught up in the unipolar moment in the early 1990s. This was the so-called end of history, as Francis Fukuyama put it, the end point of humankind's ideological evolution, the universalisation of Western liberal democracy. This was held by liberals, conservatives, Democrats and Republicans. They expressed themselves in different ways, but over time, in that 93, 94, 95, 96 period, that's what led to NATO expansion and the different conception of America's world role to the one that George H.W. Bush had envisioned in the early 1990s. That's what I would argue. With respect to Putin, look, the conventional wisdom in the Western press is that he's not simply a nationalist, which I think most people acknowledge that he is, and that he's concerned about Russian ethnic interests in Russia's near abroad. From the Western perspective, Russia's leader, Putin, is seen to be either engaging in a new Cold War or reviving the Russian Empire. Now, I mean, I would argue, on the contrary, I think his actions have been, all things considered, defensive. With respect to Crimea, he only had authorised the military incursion after the European Union and the Obama administration called on the protests to bring down a government that was in cahoots with Moscow. And, you know, again, look at it from Russia's vantage point. This threatened their sense of sphere of influence. It threatened their sense of security interests. And to lose Ukraine, he felt that he must need to go into Crimea to protect what he had, because he knew that there were 60% of ethnic Russians living in the peninsula. It was a home of the main Black Sea fleet for the Russians, and they couldn't get there via land. So these were concerns that he had. Now, of course, there is a danger that he may well miscalculate. And that's why I suspect, getting back to the original point here, that he's being a bit cautious about interfering in the eastern part of Ukraine, because he knows that any Russian military campaign in eastern Ukraine will not be as bloodless as the incursion in Crimea. And he would suffer huge sanctions, which would undoubtedly take a toll on the economy. And politically, he would lose Ukraine once and for all to the West. So I think he's actually been more defensive rather than expansionist during this crisis. Again, this is a minority view, but I think it always helps to look at these things from the vantage point of one's opponents.
We've got 3 more people who are biting at the bit, and I'll take them in order, but only 3 more. Professor Tim Florin, you're next.
Thanks, Tom, for a really interesting talk, and I'm sort of not in this field, so it's maybe a very naive question, but I'm just asking you, could you speculate on how events might have been different if the nuclear capability in Ukraine had been dismantled? I don't know who was holding the trigger, who was holding the buttons, pressing the buttons, but
Great.
how different?
Do you want to do the 3 questions? I'll answer on the last one.
Oh no, do them one at a time.
Great question, and I'm sorry I did not even mention that issue. In 1994 there was an agreement that Ukraine, which stopped a lot of the nuclear weapons, would let go of jettison all of its nuclear weapons on the grounds that it would have an agreement with the West and an agreement from Russia that its territorial integrity would be respected. Look, big mistake. It was a foolish mistake on the Ukrainians' part because now they no longer have a deterrent against Russia's conventional forces. I mean, you know, this is a minority view again, but a lot of academic realists would argue that nuclear weapons have helped keep the peace. And Ukraine would not be anywhere near as threatened today if it kept its nuclear weapons, because Russia would have to recognise that deterrent. And that's one of the reasons why I opposed the Iraq War, because I thought that the threat that Saddam Hussein posed could have been contained the way it had been since the previous Gulf War, through not just a naval blockade, sanctions regime and the no-fly zone, but because of nuclear weapons. That if he invaded, if he struck at Israel with nuclear weapons, it would guarantee massive American retaliation. And I think deterrence can work. India and Pakistan have had 3 very bloody conventional wars since the mid-1940s. But since both nations acquired nuclear technology and nuclear weapons, nuclear bombs, there's been relative peace in the last 40 years. Fascinating.
Alex.
When we move to the Baltics, we read that the ethnic Russians